Marriage in early Chinese civilization was not a personal decision. It was a carefully orchestrated agreement between two families, rooted in a philosophy that emphasized duty, hierarchy, and harmony. In the earliest dynasties, particularly the Zhou, which ruled from around 1046 to 256 BCE, marriage was a social institution designed to preserve lineage and fulfill ancestral obligations. Becoming a bride in this period meant stepping into a role that was larger than oneself. It was not simply about joining a new household. It was about representing one family, entering another, and upholding the values of both. During the Zhou period, the marriage process was formalized into a structured system known as the Six Rites. This six-step process defined the way marriages were arranged and performed, and it would influence wedding practices for centuries to come. First came the proposal, initiated not by the couple, but by the groom's family, often through a matchmaker. If the bride's family agreed, the next step involved exchanging the birth dates of the couple. These dates were analysed for astrological compatibility. Marriage was not considered appropriate unless the stars aligned favourably. If the signs were promising, betrothal gifts were offered by the groom's family, ranging from cloth and grain to livestock or jade. The bride's family would respond with their own offerings, marking the beginning of a formal agreement between both households. Once the families had accepted the match, a formal bride price would be negotiated, along with the dowry. These transactions were not simply financial. They were symbolic exchanges that reinforced social bonds and demonstrated mutual respect. After setting an auspicious date, chosen according to lunar calendars and divination, preparations for the wedding ceremony would begin. For the bride, this marked the end of her childhood. In many cases, she was a teenager, sometimes as young as 14. She would spend her final days in her family's home in quiet preparation, often receiving instruction from her mother or elder female relatives. These teachings emphasized obedience, humility, and the importance of fulfilling her role as a daughter-in-law. A bride was expected to leave her natal home and become fully integrated into her husband's family. This transition was permanent. She would not inherit from her parents, nor could she return to their household after marriage, except under rare or unfortunate circumstances. On the day of the wedding, the bride was dressed in ritual garments that signified purity and readiness, while the red wedding robe we associate with later dynasties had not yet become universal. Colours like black and deep red were already used for their symbolic associations with solemnity and fortune. Her hair would be styled in a formal knot, marking the transformation from maidenhood to marriage. Sometimes a thin veil or cloth was draped over her head to shield her from view during the procession. She was then placed inside a wooden sedan chair, carried by porters from her home to the house of the groom. The procession was accompanied by drums, flutes and firecrackers, meant to ward off evil spirits and announce the union to the community. Along the route, bystanders might toss rice or petals as blessings. Symbolic items like wild geese were sometimes displayed to represent loyalty, since geese mate for life. The entire journey was part ritual, part performance, emphasizing the importance of the occasion, not just for the couple, but for the families and community as a whole. Upon arriving at the groom's household, the bride remained silent and still, in keeping with expectations of modesty and virtue. She was led to the ceremonial hall, where she and the groom would perform the three bows, one to heaven and earth, one to the ancestors, and one to each other. These acts formalized the marriage spiritually and socially. The couple then shared a ceremonial drink, typically a sweet rice wine, sipped from 2 cups tied together with red string or ribbon. This drink symbolized unity and the joining of fates. That night, the bride entered the bridal chamber. In early dynasties, the room was simply arranged red candles and bedding to mark the occasion. The couple had likely never spoken more than a few words to each other before this moment. Their marriage had been arranged on their behalf. The first night was a formality for some, a mystery for others. It marked the beginning of a life together that would, ideally, be rooted in respect, duty, and the production of heirs. From that point forward, the bride's identity shifted entirely. She was now part of her husband's family. Her daily life would be shaped by the expectations of her in-laws. Her duties included household management, serving the elders, and bearing children, preferably sons to continue the family line. The success of her marriage was not measured by emotional connection or personal happiness, but by her ability to integrate, endure, and produce. Women had little legal recourse in the event of marital conflict. Divorce was rare and could only be initiated by the husband. Widows were often expected to remain loyal to their husband's family, and sometimes even to live in seclusion. These norms were rooted in Confucian ideals, which increasingly emphasized female chastity and obedience as moral virtues. Yet within this system, there were still moments of tenderness and individual experience. Some marriages developed into genuine partnerships. Others were characterized by distance or silence. But for the bride in early Chinese dynasties, the role was clear and the path was narrow. Her life, from the moment she stepped into the wedding procession, was defined by responsibility, sacrifice, and the unspoken hope that her new household would receive her with kindness. This was the beginning of womanhood for millions of Chinese brides over the centuries. A ceremonial departure, a solemn arrival, and the quiet start of a new identity in a world structured by tradition. During the Tang and Song dynasties, marriage in China continued to reflect the structured Confucian ideals of family and hierarchy that had emerged in earlier periods. But new cultural developments began to subtly shape the role of the bride and the atmosphere of the wedding itself. If the early dynasties laid the foundation of what it meant to be a wife and daughter-in-law, the Tang and Song periods began to refine and ornament that structure with art, poetry, symbolism, and shifts in household dynamics. Together, these two dynasties, spanning roughly from the 7th century to the 13th, represent a crucial era in the evolution of Chinese matrimonial customs. In the Tang dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907 CE, marriage was still governed by many of the principles established centuries earlier. Arranged marriages were the norm. Matchmakers were still employed to facilitate agreements between families, and personal choice in marital selection remained rare. A woman's marriageability was determined by her family's social standing, her reputation for modesty, and her household skills. In aristocratic circles, marriage also had strong political and economic overtones. Daughters were married off to secure alliances, elevate status, or consolidate wealth. Dowries remained a central feature of this transaction. A bride's family was expected to provide a dowry consisting of goods, textiles, sometimes land or servants, and these offerings helped to protect her standing in her new household. The dowry was more than a gift. It was the bride's personal wealth, legally hers to retain within the marriage, and it could provide her a limited degree of security or independence. One of the most striking cultural traits of the Tang dynasty was its cosmopolitan nature. China's capital city at the time, Chang'an, was a flourishing metropolis, home to traders, travellers and officials from across the Silk Road. This environment encouraged a more eclectic and artistic expression of cultural identity, and this was reflected in the customs surrounding weddings. A Tang dynasty wedding in a noble household, for example, might be an opulent, highly ceremonial event, featuring elaborate attire, grand musical performances, and poetic recitations. Brides from wealthy families wore richly embroidered silk robes dyed in vibrant colours, including red, green and gold. By this time, the colour red was becoming firmly associated with celebration, joy and fortune, and was increasingly favoured for wedding garments. The red bridal veil, known as the Hongai Tu, may not have been used universally yet, but its symbolic role was becoming more established. A Tang bride's appearance on her wedding day was considered a reflection of her family's taste and status. Cosmetics, hairstyling, and ornamental jewellery were all part of her preparation. Women in the Tang era enjoyed more freedom in appearance compared to earlier periods. Fuller figures were considered fashionable, and makeup trends included powdering the face white, applying rouge to the cheeks and lips, and sometimes painting small floral designs on the forehead. The bride's hair might be styled into complex coils and decorated with gold pins, hairpieces, or even small phoenix-shaped ornaments. The legendary Fengguan, or phoenix crown, a symbol of feminine nobility, was beginning to take shape in this period, though its more elaborate versions would not become standard until the Ming Dynasty. The Tang era also marked a time when poetry flourished, and wedding rituals were sometimes infused with literary flourishes. It was not uncommon for the groom, if he were literate and of high status, to compose a poem for his bride, recited during or after the wedding banquet. This practice elevated the emotional and aesthetic experience of marriage, blending personal expression with ceremonial obligation. However, it is important to note that despite the beauty and elegance of these rituals, the practical realities of the bride's role remained anchored in tradition. Her primary duties after marriage were still to serve her in-laws, bear children, and manage domestic responsibilities. The structure of the wedding ceremony itself remained largely unchanged from previous eras. The three vows, first heaven and earth, then to the ancestors, then to each other, were still performed. These acts reaffirmed the central role of ritual and hierarchy in Chinese marriage. Following the ceremony, a banquet was held, often lasting several hours or even multiple days in wealthy households. Food served during the wedding were symbolic and auspicious. Dishes such as whole fish represented abundance, while sweet rice cakes signified unity and a smooth life ahead. The use of mandarin ducks as symbols of marital fidelity also became more widespread during this time, appearing in embroidery, ceramics, and decorative objects given to the couple. The wedding night, or the first night the bride and groom spent together as husband and wife, was still treated with both ritual solemnity and festive teasing. The bridal chamber was decorated in red, with candles, auspicious couplets, and sometimes playful tokens scattered across the bed. Fruits and nuts, for example, symbolising fertility and the hope for sons. The couple would drink cross-cupped wine, sometimes joined by friends and relatives who gathered outside the chamber to sing teasing songs or offer humorous advice. This practice, known as Nao Dongfang, literally disturbing the bridal chamber, was a culturally sanctioned form of ice-breaking, often involving light-hearted jokes or games. Though such traditions could be intrusive, they were meant to ease tension and ensure a lively, joyful start to the marriage. The Song dynasty, which followed the Tang and lasted from 960 to 1279 CE, brought with it a quieter, more introspective tone to Chinese culture. Where the Tang dynasty had been bold and outward-looking, the Song dynasty was marked by a return to Confucian conservatism and a deepening of ethical and domestic values. These shifts were visible in changes to how weddings were performed, how brides were prepared for marriage, and how the institution of marriage was perceived in broader society. In the Song era, arranged marriages remained universal, and the bride's consent was still not considered necessary. However, the ideals surrounding marriage began to emphasize emotional refinement and moral education. A well-mannered, literate woman who demonstrated modesty and obedience, was valued as a paragon of domestic virtue. Households increasingly placed importance on the role of women as quiet managers of the inner quarters, expected to be intelligent, frugal and supportive, while remaining publicly invisible. Weddings in the Song dynasty reflected these ideals. While the 6 ritual steps remained the same in broad outline: proposal, horoscope matching, dowry exchange, setting a wedding date, wedding ceremony, and bridal procession, there was an increased focus on formal etiquette, proper dress, and the symbolism of every action. A Song bride was expected to maintain a modest and reserved demeanour. On her wedding day, she wore garments that were richly made but relatively conservative in appearance. The sleeves were long, the silhouette layered, and the colours often included red or vermilion with accents of green or blue. Foot binding, which had originated in the late Tang period as an elite practice, became more widespread among upper-class Song women. Brides from wealthy households often had bound feet and wore elaborately embroidered silk slippers as part of their wedding ensemble. The symbolism embedded in a Song wedding extended to even the most minor details. The bridal sedan chair was not just transportation, it was part of a larger procession filled with meaning. Drummers and flutists led the way, followed by bearers carrying the bride's dowry items on decorated trays. These dowry items might include bronze mirrors, lacquered boxes, bedding, small chests of coin, or carved combs, all representing the family's care and investment in their daughter's future. Some dowries were accompanied by poetic inscriptions or verses attached to the items, reinforcing the aesthetic elegance that characterized Song culture. Upon arriving at the groom's household, the bride participated in the ritual bows and then was escorted to the inner quarters. In keeping with the customs of the time, she remained veiled until the formal introduction to her new husband in the bridal chamber. The veil was then lifted, either by hand or with a symbolic instrument such as a wooden rod or scale, and the couple would share a ritual drink. The room was decorated with the same symbols that had appeared in earlier dynasties: red fabrics, candles, calligraphy scrolls with blessings, and food items placed strategically to invite fertility and joy. If the groom was a scholar or official, there might also be poetry scrolls displayed or books placed prominently to signal a cultured household. One notable aspect of the Song period was the increased legal recognition of the bride's dowry as her personal property. This meant that a woman brought assets into the marriage that were, in theory, under her own control. In practice, many still deferred to their husbands or mothers-in-law in financial matters, but the acknowledgement of the dowry's legal status marked a small but meaningful shift. In the event of widowhood or conflict, a woman might rely on her dowry as a means of securing her welfare or returning to her natal family. The wedding banquet remained a key part of the celebrations. In elite families, multiple courses were served, each one selected for its symbolic significance: duck, representing fidelity; lotus seeds, symbolizing fertility; long noodles for a long life. Guests offered toasts, recited poems, and exchanged compliments. In rural or lower-class households, the celebrations were simpler but still meaningful. A single table might be laid out in the courtyard, with dumplings, rice, pickled vegetables, and warm wine. The community gathered to acknowledge the couple's union, even if the formality of the rituals was reduced. Throughout the Song period, women were subject to increasing constraints on their behaviour and public presence, but the role of the bride remained one of the most publicly celebrated milestones in a woman's life. Even as female mobility declined and Confucian expectations became more demanding, weddings still provided a space for women to be honoured and adorned, even if briefly. The day of the wedding marked the height of ceremonial attention a woman might receive, after which she would largely retreat into the rhythms of domestic life. Despite the restrictions, some women in the Song dynasty found subtle ways to assert their presence. Literate women sometimes composed wedding verses, and their calligraphy or embroidery was preserved within the family. There are records of women advising their husbands on household affairs, or raising highly educated sons who would go on to pass the imperial examinations. These contributions were not celebrated publicly, but they reflect the quiet influence that many women maintained within the family system. The wedding, in that context, was not the end of a woman's identity, but the beginning of her opportunity to shape a household. By the end of the Song period, the key features of the traditional Chinese wedding were firmly in place: red garments and veils, formalized rites of passage, intricate dowries, and a domestic life defined by hierarchy and duty. What changed, and continued to change, was the cultural meaning attached to those customs. The growing importance of literacy, refinement, and ethical conduct in defining the ideal bride. These values would deepen further in the centuries to come, shaping the lives of countless women who stepped into their wedding garments not as individuals seeking romance, but as daughters fulfilling centuries of expectation. The end of the Song dynasty in the late 13th century marked a profound shift in Chinese history. When the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, they brought with them a different set of cultural norms and legal frameworks that altered, at least temporarily, many of the long-standing customs that had defined Han Chinese marriage for centuries. While the overall structure of arranged marriage remained, and Confucian ideals were never fully abandoned, the Yuan period introduced a new layer of complexity to the institution of marriage, one influenced by Mongol nomadic traditions, Islamic legal codes, and the increasingly diverse population of the empire. During the Yuan dynasty, which lasted from 1271 to 1368, China was part of a vast empire that stretched across much of Eurasia. The ruling elite were Mongol, while the majority of the population was still Han Chinese. Social and ethnic hierarchies were clearly delineated, with Mongols at the top, followed by various Central Asian peoples, and Han Chinese divided into northern and southern classifications. This caste-like system affected marriage customs, as different rules applied to different social groups. Mongol families, especially those of military or administrative rank, often practiced polygamy. Multiple wives and concubines were accepted, and marriage alliances among Mongol clans were essential tools of political strategy. For Han Chinese brides, marriage continued to follow traditional patterns in many respects, but they were now living under foreign rule. The state recognized multiple legal codes, and a bride's status and rights could depend on her ethnic background, social class, and location. In general, Han Chinese women were still married young, typically in their mid-teens, through arrangements made by their families. The six rites were still followed, though sometimes simplified, particularly in rural areas or among lower classes. The rituals remained deeply symbolic. Brides still wore red, still rode in sedan chairs, and still bowed to ancestors. But the tone of the times had changed. The presence of Mongol influence meant that some aspects of Chinese custom were weakened, while others became emphasized as markers of cultural identity. In response to the dominance of Mongol rule, many Han Chinese families clung more tightly to their traditions. Weddings became an arena where cultural values were preserved and passed on. Mothers taught their daughters the importance of modesty and silence. Fathers arranged marriages not only for social gain, but to maintain a sense of continuity in a fractured era. Weddings became symbols of endurance as much as celebration. One notable difference in the Yuan period was the legal treatment of widows and remarriage. In previous dynasties, a woman who lost her husband was expected and often pressured to remain unmarried for the rest of her life, especially if she had borne children. This ideal of widow chastity was rooted in Confucian morality and framed as a form of lifelong loyalty to the husband's family. However, under Mongol administration, remarriage for widows was permitted and at times encouraged. This marked a significant departure from Han Chinese norms. The Mongol rulers didn't enforce widow chastity and even passed laws that allowed widows to reclaim portions of their dowry upon remarriage. This created tension between state policy and cultural values. While some Han women did remarry under these conditions, others resisted, preferring to conform to the moral ideals of their own communities. For brides during the Yuan dynasty, this meant navigating not only the expectations of their husband's household, but also the broader political and cultural context of an empire ruled by outsiders. The wedding rituals themselves were familiar: red robes, cross-cupped wine, family banquets. But the atmosphere was marked by uncertainty. In elite circles, Chinese and Mongol customs sometimes merged. A Mongol groom might accept a Han bride, and the resulting wedding might blend traditions from both cultures. In other cases, marriages were kept strictly within ethnic or religious communities with little overlap. Among non-Han groups within the empire, such as the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hui Muslims, marriage customs could be radically different. Islamic communities, for example, often practiced nikah, a legally binding contract that included stipulations regarding the dowry, divorce rights, and spousal obligations. These contracts were sometimes written in Arabic or Persian, and they provided women with clearer legal protections than were typical in Han Chinese society. In some Muslim communities, a bride had the right to set conditions for her marriage or request a divorce under specific circumstances, rights that were not available to most Han women. The coexistence of these different systems within the Yuan Empire reflected its diverse population and decentralized legal structure. Despite these variations, certain common themes persisted. A bride was still expected to leave her natal home and enter her husband's family. She was still judged primarily by her obedience, her skill in domestic work, and her ability to bear children. Whether she lived in a Mongol yurt, a Chinese courtyard, or a mountain village along the Tibetan plateau, her marriage would likely have been arranged, her role circumscribed, and her status dependent on her ability to conform to the expectations of others. As the Yuan dynasty gave way to the Ming in the late 14th century, many Chinese intellectuals and officials sought to reassert traditional Han values. They saw the Mongol period as one of foreign disorder and moral decline, and they worked actively to restore what they viewed as proper Confucian norms. For brides, this meant a renewed emphasis on chastity, obedience, and the rigid enforcement of family hierarchy. But before exploring the Ming revival of Confucian marriage ideals, it's important to linger a moment longer in the daily life of the Yuan bride. In cities like Dadu, modern-day Beijing, a young bride might have been the daughter of a merchant or artisan. Her family could afford silk garments, lacquered dowry boxes, and a small wedding banquet. Her wedding day was still one of ceremony. She might have worn red shoes embroidered with lotus petals, her feet only partially bound, depending on the family's class and openness to Mongol influence. The bridal veil, made of fine gauze, was tied with a golden knot. Her sedan chair might have been modest, carried by relatives instead of hired porters. Firecrackers still lined the route, onlookers still shouted blessings, and at the gates of her new home, she still bowed low before stepping inside. In rural provinces, things were simpler. Brides from farming communities followed abbreviated customs, perhaps only a single bow, a simple exchange of gifts, and a meal shared under a thatched roof. Yet even in these modest settings, the meaning of marriage carried weight. It was the central rite of passage for a woman. It marked the end of one identity and the start of another. Her family name faded into the background. Her loyalties were redirected. She now belonged, officially and completely, to another household. Among the Mongol elite, meanwhile, marriage took on a different character. Daughters of prominent families were often used to secure strategic alliances. Polygamy was common, especially for men of high rank. A Mongol nobleman might have multiple wives, each with her own tent and servants. These wives held ranked positions within the household, with the first wife occupying the most honoured status. The daily life of such a bride differed sharply from that of a Han Chinese woman, but some responsibilities were shared. She managed household affairs, participated in hospitality rituals, and raised children according to the traditions of her group. It is worth noting that some Mongol women wielded considerable power. They were often more mobile and visible in public life than their Chinese counterparts. Some served as regents or advisors during times of transition. Their roles in the domestic and political spheres were not mutually exclusive. However, this level of influence was limited to the upper classes. For ordinary Mongol brides, life was still circumscribed by the expectations of gender, obedience and fertility. As with earlier dynasties, most weddings included feasting, music, and symbolic gestures. Shared bowls of food, offerings to family ancestors or tribal spirits, and gestures of humility and unity were common. The particulars differed, but the underlying themes were the same. A wedding was a community event. It signified continuity, loyalty, and stability. In some mixed communities, places where Mongol officials lived among Han farmers, or where traders from Central Asia settled alongside Chinese townspeople, marriage customs could blend in unexpected ways. A Han bride might adopt aspects of Mongol dress. A Mongol groom might participate in Chinese bowing rituals. Over time, some of these blended practices became localized customs in their own right, passed down not through official edicts, but through habit and memory. The Yuan dynasty was not a golden age for women, yet in the folds of these overlapping systems, there were moments of complexity, contradiction, and adaptation. Some brides resisted new customs, others embraced them. Some found gentler lives in households that valued cooperation and respect. Others endured rigid hierarchies, difficult in-laws, or uncertain futures. The experience of being a bride during this era depended on where you lived, who you married, and how you moved through the invisible boundaries of class, ethnicity, and gender. When the Ming dynasty finally emerged in 1368, it came with a renewed push to re-establish orthodox Confucianism. Marriage was once again used as a moral framework for society, and the bride, her silence, her virtue, her devotion, became a powerful symbol of cultural renewal. But in the years of the Yuan, those values were in flux. And for the bride walking the dusty road to her new home, veil over her eyes, silence on her lips, and uncertainty in her heart, the only thing that mattered was what waited on the other side of the threshold. The rise of the Ming dynasty in 1368 marked the return of Han Chinese rule and a sweeping restoration of traditional Confucian values. The Mongol-led Yuan dynasty was overthrown, and the new imperial government worked diligently to reassert cultural norms that had been diluted or challenged under foreign rule. Nowhere was this cultural resurgence more clearly seen than in the rituals surrounding marriage. In Ming China, the wedding was not only a personal or familial affair, it became a stage on which morality, virtue, and social order were publicly performed. The Ming dynasty lasted nearly 3 centuries, from the late 14th to the mid-17th century. During this time, the ideals of womanhood were shaped by a vision of hierarchy, loyalty, and moral discipline. For brides, this translated into a renewed emphasis on chastity, obedience, and complete devotion to the husband's family. The marriage ceremony was more elaborate than ever before, layered with symbolic gestures and strict formalities. Yet beneath the grandeur, the lived experience of the bride remained deeply constrained. She was celebrated on her wedding day, then swiftly folded into the unrelenting rhythm of household duty. The ceremonial preparation for a Ming wedding began months in advance. Arranged marriages were still universal, and families typically consulted fortune tellers or astrologers to ensure compatibility. The birth charts of the bride and groom were compared to determine the most auspicious date for the wedding. The process followed the same 6 basic steps first codified in the Zhou dynasty: the proposal, the exchange of names and birth dates, the delivery of betrothal gifts, the dowry preparation, the choosing of the wedding date, and finally, the wedding itself. These steps had become so institutionalized that even lower-class families tried to follow them in some form, though often with simplified rituals. Dowries during the Ming period were extensive, especially among the merchant and gentry classes. A wealthy bride might bring with her lacquered trunks filled with textiles, tea, jewellery, porcelain, bedding, clothing, and even domestic servants. These dowries were paraded publicly in processions days before the ceremony, with bearers carrying each item through the streets as a symbol of the bride's worth and the generosity of her family. This public display reinforced social hierarchies and offered families a chance to assert their status before the community. The groom's family, in turn, provided a bride price, cash or goods presented as a gesture of respect and exchange. The day before the wedding, the bride would undergo a bathing and dressing ritual. She was assisted by female relatives, her mother, aunts, and sometimes professional attendants, who helped her bathe in water infused with flowers and herbs meant to purify and bless her. Her hair was washed, dried, and styled into a formal knot. Her eyebrows were plucked into delicate arches, and her face powdered to a pale glow. Rouge was applied to her cheeks and lips. In elite households, she might wear a phoenix crown, an ornate headdress adorned with pearls, gold filigree, and kingfisher feathers, symbolizing nobility, fidelity, and prosperity. This crown was heavy and elaborate, sometimes weighing several pounds. It framed the bride's face like a halo of wealth and symbolism. Her wedding dress was almost always red, now fully established as the colour of joy, protection, and luck. The fabric was embroidered with phoenixes, peonies, dragons, and clouds. Each symbol conveyed a wish for harmony, fertility, and abundance. In some cases, the embroidery was so intricate that it took months to complete. Wealthier families hired professional seamstresses to create gowns that would be worn only once, but remembered for a lifetime. The final touch was the red veil, a long gauzy cloth fastened over the bride's head, obscuring her face until it was lifted by the groom. The wedding procession itself was a spectacle. The bride was carried from her family's home to the groom's house in a red, lacquered sedan chair, accompanied by drums, gongs, and fireworks. A team of porters, musicians, and relatives formed a noisy celebratory parade. Onlookers lined the streets to watch, comment, and offer blessings. The louder the procession, the better. It was believed that noise would chase away malevolent spirits and ensure a smooth transition for the bride. In some areas, the groom's family sent a boy child to greet the bride at the door of the sedan chair, a symbolic gesture meant to invoke fertility and the hope for sons. Upon arrival at the groom's home, the bride performed the same 3 bows still central to Chinese wedding ritual, one to heaven and earth, one to the groom's ancestors, and one to the groom himself. These bows were often guided by a master of ceremonies who instructed the couple in every movement and ensured each step was performed correctly. After the formal rites, the couple entered the bridal chamber. There, they performed the cross-cupped wine ritual, each holding a cup of wine and crossing arms to sip. This act symbolized unity and mutual dependence. Only then was the bride's veil lifted. It was the first moment the groom saw her face clearly. For many couples, this was also the first moment of real interaction. The bridal chamber was decorated in red from ceiling to floor. Red silk draped the bed, red candles burned in tall holders, and red character scrolls reading "Double Happiness, Nick Shy" were pasted on walls and furniture. Peanuts, dates, and lotus seeds were scattered across the bed to symbolize fertility and the hope for many sons. In some households, friends and younger relatives participated in games, and teasing songs meant to entertain and ease the awkwardness of the first night. These rituals were meant to be playful, but they also served to reinforce community involvement in the private lives of newlyweds. The next morning, the bride formally greeted her new in-laws, offering tea to each elder in order of status. This was her first public act of obedience within her new family, and it marked the beginning of her life as a daughter-in-law. In the months and years that followed, she would be judged on how well she fulfilled her duties, rising early, managing household affairs, bearing children, and treating her husband's parents with absolute respect. Her own name would gradually be used less often. She would be referred to in relation to others as wife of, mother of, or daughter-in-law of. Among the common people, these rituals were simplified but still carried deep meaning. In rural villages, a bride might not wear a phoenix crown, but her robe would still be red, her hair neatly combed and her steps silent as she crossed the threshold into her new life. Firecrackers, symbolic food, and red decorations were used in nearly every household, no matter how modest. A single chicken might be slaughtered for the feast. The ceremony might take place in a dirt courtyard, but the structure of the marriage, the expectations of submission, service, and endurance was nearly identical. The Ming Dynasty also saw the rise of stricter moral codes for women, especially regarding widowhood. Widows who chose not to remarry were praised in official records and sometimes rewarded with memorial arches erected in their honour. These arches, called Zhenjipaifang, were stone structures engraved with the woman's name and a phrase declaring her chastity. The government actively encouraged this behaviour, using widow chastity as a tool to promote Confucian virtue. This pressure made life even more difficult for women who had lost their husbands at a young age. Choosing to remarry became socially dangerous, even if financially necessary. Instructional texts such as Nu Jie, or Admonitions for Women, were reprinted and circulated widely during this time. These books emphasized the virtues of silence, modesty, hard work, and loyalty. Girls were taught from a young age that their future depended on being obedient wives and diligent housekeepers. They were not encouraged to speak their minds, pursue education, or form personal ambitions. Their worth was measured by how well they supported others. Despite these limitations, some brides found subtle ways to assert influence within the home. A clever daughter-in-law might rise to manage the household finances. A respected wife might help her husband make business decisions behind closed doors. Some women left behind beautifully embroidered garments, poetry, or personal diaries, which today offer rare glimpses into their inner lives. But these traces were exceptional. Most brides lived in quiet anonymity, their names lost to time, their experiences folded into the fabric of family history. For those born into the lower classes, marriage could be both a burden and a survival strategy. Brides were often sent far from their homes, married to labourers or farmers whom they had never met. The wedding might be conducted in a single day, with minimal ceremony. Yet even here, the symbolism remained. The red cloth, the ritual bowing, the role of the bride as the thread that bound two families. These customs persisted, deeply woven into the cultural psyche. As the Ming dynasty progressed, the ideal bride became increasingly static. She was expected to be graceful but invisible, strong but silent, central to the household yet without authority. Her wedding day might be her most adorned moment, a fleeting recognition of her passage into womanhood. After that, her life became a cycle of service, first to her in-laws, then to her husband, and finally to her children. In some cases, daughters-in-law lived under harsh conditions, bearing the weight of multiple generations under one roof. Disputes with mothers-in-law were common, but the bride's ability to remain quiet and respectful was considered proof of her virtue. In literature and drama of the Ming period, ideal brides were portrayed as self-sacrificing and emotionally restrained. Stories of women who threw themselves into rivers rather than remarry, or who died from grief after their husbands passed away, were used as moral examples. These tales were copied into textbooks, printed on woodblocks, and performed in village theatres. They became models for real-life behaviour, shaping the expectations of girls who had yet to wear the red veil. Yet not all brides fit the mould. In the corners of the empire, in fishing towns, mountain villages, and border provinces, women lived different lives. Some ran market stalls, some left abusive husbands, and some raised children on their own. These women were rarely recorded in official histories, but they existed, and they too were brides once, walking slowly toward a future shaped by tradition and resilience. The Ming dynasty was marked by a clear division between ideal and reality. Official policies, educational materials, and public monuments praised the obedient, silent, and chaste bride. But the lived experience of women was far more varied, shaped by class, geography, personality, and circumstance. Marriage was still the central event in a woman's life, but how that event unfolded and how life continued afterward differed widely between the homes of the powerful and the huts of the poor. In elite urban households, a bride's wedding was an orchestrated affair, often involving months of preparation. Families hired specialists to manage everything, astrologers to select the wedding date, musicians to compose and rehearse ceremonial pieces, tailors to craft layers of formal garments, and matchmakers to oversee negotiations. These weddings resembled small theatrical productions, with every detail choreographed, every gesture steeped in meaning. But for many brides, the opulence masked anxiety. Behind the layers of red silk and layers of etiquette was a young woman, often still in her mid-teens, about to enter a household where she knew no one, bound to a man she had likely never spoken to. The ceremony was not only a celebration, it was also a kind of public performance of the bride's virtue. She was expected to appear serene, controlled and modest, never smiling too broadly or looking directly at the groom. Too much expressiveness was seen as inappropriate. Even joy had to be disciplined. Her body language was observed and later discussed by guests, relatives and neighbours. Her stillness, her downcast eyes, her silence. These were her qualifications, the quiet resume she submitted on her wedding day. Once inside her husband's home, she was judged not by her words, but by her behaviour. Did she rise before the rest of the household? Did she offer tea properly? Did she avoid idle gossip? Did she obey her mother-in-law without complaint? These questions formed the daily metrics by which her character was measured. Praise from her in-laws could elevate her position. Criticism could isolate her. The first few months were critical. Many brides lived in fear of doing or saying the wrong thing. Some developed quiet coping strategies, keeping to themselves, speaking only when spoken to, or burying their feelings in domestic tasks. Among middle-class and artisan families, wedding practices were simpler but no less meaningful. In a merchant household, for instance, the bride might still wear red silk, though perhaps in fewer layers. Her phoenix crown might be made of tin or brass rather than gold. The dowry was modest, perhaps bedding, cookware, a mirror, and 1 or 2 pieces of jewellery, but still symbolic. The wedding banquet might feature 5 or 6 dishes rather than 20, yet the expectations placed upon her were much the same. She was to serve the family, bear children, and maintain order within the home. In these households, the bride's ability to manage practical affairs became central to her value. She might be responsible for budgeting, managing servants or apprentices, preparing seasonal supplies, and ensuring rituals were performed properly at household altars. Her competence determined not just her own comfort, but the household's reputation and success. In some cases, if her husband travelled frequently for business or served in an administrative role away from home, the wife effectively managed the entire household. Though her authority was informal and confined to the domestic sphere, it was real, and in quiet ways, it could be powerful. In farming villages and mountain towns, the rituals of marriage were adapted to fit local resources. A bride's veil might be dyed with homemade pigments. Her gown could be hand-stitched by her mother or aunt. Instead of an elaborate dowry procession, relatives might carry bundles wrapped in cloth or bamboo baskets. The wedding procession could be just a small group of neighbours walking alongside her, singing simple songs, carrying offerings of dried goods or chickens. But even in these humble weddings, red remained the dominant colour. The meanings behind the rituals were preserved, even if the materials were not. Firecrackers were lit, offerings made, and the couple still performed their vows before heaven, earth, and ancestors. The same symbolic foods were served, even if in smaller portions. Sweet dates, boiled peanuts, and longevity noodles. For rural brides, transition into marriage was often immediate and demanding. Upon arriving at her new home, she was expected to begin working almost at once, sweeping floors, washing rice, drawing water. There was no adjustment period. Her value to the family was based on her labour as much as her behaviour. Unlike in wealthy households where the bride might be eased into her role with help from servants or relatives, rural brides learned by doing. Their wedding night might involve sharing a sleeping mat with strangers in the next room, or cooking breakfast for the family the next morning with no guidance. These women adapted quickly or suffered quietly. For many, hardship was simply expected. Despite these difficulties, there were small joys. In villages, a good marriage might offer companionship, shared labour, or respect from the husband's family. If a mother-in-law was kind, or if the husband valued his wife's efforts, the bride could gradually carve out a sense of belonging. In some cases, couples grew close over time. Shared struggles in the fields, the raising of children, or the management of seasonal shortages created bonds that ceremony alone could not guarantee. Though romance was rarely the basis for marriage, affection sometimes grew in its own quiet way. However, the bride's place in the household was always subordinate. Even after bearing children, her position could be precarious, especially if she did not produce sons. Sons were the carriers of the family name and the heirs to ancestral duties. Without them, a woman's place in the family could be questioned. In rare cases, husbands were encouraged by their families to take concubines, if the wife had not produced a male heir within a few years. This practice was more common in elite and middle-class households, but even among the poor, pressure could mount. The emotional toll on brides in these situations was immense. Some withdrew further into domestic labour. Others endured with resignation. A few, though rarely documented, resisted through silence, illness, or quiet defiance. There was also the shadow of the dowry. Though technically the bride's property, a dowry could become a source of conflict. If a marriage soured or the household fell into financial trouble, the dowry might be seized or sold by the husband's family. Some women entered marriage with strong dowries and were able to use them as a form of leverage, buying gifts for in-laws, funding repairs to the house, or using it to protect their children's future. Others entered with nothing, entirely dependent on the goodwill of the household they married into. In either case, the dowry was more than material. It was a symbol of security, or the lack of it. Emotionally, the experience of marriage was deeply isolating for many women. Leaving behind their natal family was not only a change of address, but a severing of identity. Visits back home were rare, and usually occurred only during major festivals or after childbirth. Letters were uncommon, especially among the illiterate. A bride might go months or even years without seeing her parents or siblings. In this isolation, she had to build a new sense of self, often within the narrow confines of household duty. Her joy or sorrow, hopes or fears were kept largely private. Diaries, when they exist, offer brief glimpses of inner life. A line about missing her mother, a note about a kind word from her husband, a quiet wish for a child to survive the winter. Still, resilience bloomed in these hidden spaces. Women found solace in community, in temple visits, in shared laughter while folding laundry, or in the small victories of keeping a household running smoothly. The bond between co-wives or between sisters-in-law could be a source of support. So could the friendship of a neighbour or the gentle respect of a son. These soft, unrecorded alliances shaped many women's daily lives more than imperial decrees ever did. By the late Ming period, some new voices began to appear in literature. Plays and novels written by male authors occasionally featured sympathetic portrayals of women. There were stories of clever wives who saved their families from disaster, or loyal brides who defended their honour in court. These tales reflected a subtle shift in public attitudes, though the moral of the story always reinforced traditional values. Even when a bride showed intelligence or strength, her virtue was tied to her role as a wife or mother. Still, these representations offered a mirror, distorted but present, of the lived experience of real women. And so, the Ming Dynasty preserved the ceremony and structure of Chinese marriage with a meticulous devotion. Every gesture had meaning. Every stitch in the bride's gown. Every word in the wedding contract. Every bow at the family altar. But beneath the surface, in quiet kitchens and candlelit chambers, the real experience of being a bride was layered with uncertainty, compromise and quiet adaptation. Some found contentment. Others endured with strength. All were shaped by the ceremony that had once veiled their faces in red, lifted only when it was time to begin. The Qing dynasty, established in 1644 by the Manchu people, ruled China for over 2.5 centuries. As the final imperial dynasty, it inherited the full weight of China's matrimonial traditions while introducing its own cultural layers. For brides, the Qing era brought both continuity and constraint. The expectations of virtue, obedience, and ceremonial performance intensified, especially among Han Chinese households determined to preserve their identity under foreign rule. But the Manchu elite brought their own customs to the palace and court, and the coexistence of two cultures under one empire shaped the experience of marriage across the social spectrum. At the heart of Qing marriage, customs remained the fundamental structure passed down through centuries. Arranged unions, selected through negotiation between families, reinforced by the six rites, and sanctified by ritual. A girl might be promised in marriage as early as infancy, though most weddings occurred when the bride was in her mid-teens. Rare was the woman who married by her own choice. It was still the responsibility of the father or male guardian to secure an appropriate match, one that would strengthen social ties, protect family reputation, or maintain class status. Romantic love, if it came at all, came later. For Han Chinese brides, the Qing period meant the continuation, and sometimes the intensification, of Ming values. The doctrine of female chastity reached its peak during this dynasty. Widows who refused to remarry were celebrated in local histories, praised in family genealogies, and sometimes honoured with physical memorial arches funded by the state. A woman's willingness to live in poverty, raise children alone, or even die rather than enter a second marriage was held up as the height of moral virtue. While these ideals were not always enforced equally, the cultural pressure was immense. Girls grew up hearing stories of loyal wives and self-sacrificing mothers. The moral literature of the period praised the woman who disappeared into service, who suffered without complaint. This ideology shaped every stage of a bride's transition. From the moment her marriage was arranged, she was expected to prepare not only her body and belongings but her mind, training herself to remain quiet, humble and dutiful in her future home. On her wedding day, she was draped in red, veiled completely, and led away from her family. Many brides wept quietly before entering the sedan chair that would carry them to their new lives. This public mourning was not considered improper. It was a final expression of grief for the life she was leaving behind. The wedding itself remained a carefully orchestrated event. The bride arrived to firecrackers, music, and lanterns strung with the double happiness symbol. She was led into the main hall, where she and the groom performed the bowing rituals, first to heaven and earth, then to the ancestors, and then to one another. In wealthier households, a master of ceremonies presided over the event, guiding the couple through every step. Symbolic objects were everywhere: red candles, pomegranates, lotus seeds, and peanuts, each chosen to attract luck, fertility, and longevity. Among elite families, particularly scholar officials, the wedding also served as a display of cultural refinement. Poetry was read aloud, calligraphy scrolls were exchanged, and guests offered gifts of embroidered silks or rare teas. The bride's dowry was not only material, it was a signifier of her education, upbringing, and value. Girls from upper-class families were often trained in music, embroidery, or the art of conversation, not for personal enrichment, but to demonstrate their suitability as cultured wives. These women were rarely given freedom, but they were groomed to perform it beautifully. Manchu customs added a separate layer to the courtly rituals. Unlike Han Chinese women, Manchu women did not bind their feet, and their wedding garments included a different set of symbols. The traditional Manchu bride wore a headdress shaped like a pair of butterfly wings, sometimes adorned with coral, pearls, or turquoise. Her robe was typically blue or black, with wide sleeves and intricate floral embroidery. Though many Manchu elites adopted Han rituals for political or aesthetic reasons, they also maintained their own court traditions, particularly within the Forbidden City. For brides married into the imperial family, or aristocracy, marriage was not simply a personal matter, it was an affair of state. The The Empress Dowager, or reigning emperor, had the final say in high-level matches. Brides were chosen not only for beauty or virtue, but for their clan alliances and potential usefulness within the palace hierarchy. These young women were trained from an early age in palace etiquette, their lives regulated by the Bureau of Palace Affairs. Once selected, their days were dictated by ceremonial obligations, layers of court rules, and political rivalries. Very few of these women ever saw life outside the palace again. Outside the capital, however, marriage among commoners followed more familiar patterns. In rural towns, farming villages, and merchant districts, weddings were public, noisy, and highly participatory. The community played an active role, assisting with food, firecrackers, music, and decorations. The procession from the bride's home to her new household was one of the most anticipated events in a village calendar. Even if resources were modest, families did their best to uphold tradition. A red dress was stitched or borrowed. A sedan chair was hired or substituted with a sturdy cart. Neighbours gathered to shout blessings, and distant relatives travelled for days to attend the banquet. In these households, the bride's responsibilities were practical and immediate. She was expected to rise early, prepare food, carry water, clean altars, and bear children. There was little ceremony after the wedding. In many homes, she slept in a shared room or on a straw mat behind a partition. If she entered a family with multiple generations under one roof, she might spend her first years under the constant scrutiny of her mother-in-law. In the most traditional households, she was not allowed to speak unless spoken to, and any failure in her domestic duties was reported quickly. Still, in some homes, if the family was kind, or if her husband was fair-minded, the transition could be less harsh. Over time, as she bore children and gained experience, her position improved. By the 18th and 19th centuries, even as these traditional roles remained dominant, small changes were beginning to ripple through society. The spread of print culture meant that women's instructional manuals, moral tales, and family guides were more widely available than ever before. Some literate women began writing poetry, compiling moral essays, or copying Buddhist sutras by hand. Though these activities were framed as virtuous pastimes, they also allowed for quiet reflection and self-expression. In coastal cities, increased contact with foreign merchants and missionaries introduced new ideas about education, marriage, and gender. While such influence remained limited, especially before the Opium Wars, it planted seeds of curiosity and discontent. Some families began to invest in their daughters' literacy, not for rebellion, but for improved household management and family honour. A few educated brides kept diaries, and even fewer had their writings preserved. In those pages we find fragments of doubt, hope, and the aching desire to be remembered. Yet for the vast majority of Qing brides, their voices were never recorded. Their names were preserved only in genealogy scrolls as the wife of so-and-so, the mother of so-and-so, without detail or distinction. Their wedding days may have been filled with sound, drums, laughter, ritual chanting, but what came after was often silence. A silence shaped not by passivity, but by endurance. They endured homesickness, harsh winters, failed crops, lost infants, and aging parents. They endured without ceremony and often without thanks. Their lives were framed by ritual, bounded by rules, but filled with unspoken moments of grace. A gift of new slippers from a father-in-law. A quiet conversation in the courtyard with a younger sister-in-law. The soft smile of a child climbing into their lap. In these gestures, the bride slowly became the mother, the matriarch, the woman who would one day prepare another girl for her own wedding day. By the late Qing period, The cracks in the old system were becoming visible. Political unrest, economic strain, and growing foreign influence began to challenge the foundation of family life. Opium addiction, war, and famine unsettled even the most established households. In this uncertain atmosphere, some of the rigid ideals surrounding marriage began to soften. Not officially, not in public discourse, but in the quiet decisions of ordinary families. Some parents delayed marriage for their daughters. Some brides insisted on better treatment. Some marriages became, if not equal, at least cooperative. But change was still slow. For most women, their experience of marriage in the Qing era remained structured by duty, shaped by ritual, and contained within the private sphere. It was a role they were trained for, celebrated briefly, and expected to perform for a lifetime. In the next part, we will follow these quiet transitions through the late Qing collapse into the early 20th century, and the revolutionary reimagining of what it meant to be a wife, a bride, and eventually a woman free to choose. By the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty was entering its final, unsteady decades. The empire that had ruled for over 2 centuries was fraying at the edges, politically unstable, economically pressured, and increasingly unable to shield itself from the demands of the outside world. In this environment, even the most private institution, marriage, began to shift. Not overnight, and not everywhere, but slowly and unevenly, as old expectations were questioned, renegotiated, or quietly abandoned. For brides in this era, tradition still shaped nearly every aspect of the wedding day. The red dress, the silk veil, the 3 bows, the cross-cupped wine, and the ceremonial tea offerings were all still practiced widely, especially in rural and conservative regions. The performance of virtue remained the cornerstone of what it meant to be a proper bride. A woman's modesty, her ability to serve her in-laws, her silence in public, and her skill in managing a household continued to be praised in books, praised in local histories, and passed down from mother to daughter. But the world around these women was changing. Steamships now lined the harbours. Foreign newspapers circulated in cities. Missionaries built schools for girls. Chinese intellectuals who had studied abroad returned home with radically new ideas. Among them was the belief that a woman should not be bought or sold through betrothal gifts, should not be given away without consent, and should not be confined to the domestic sphere her entire life. These were not yet dominant beliefs, but they had begun to take root. The first place these ideas found traction was in the cities: Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou. In urban areas, a small number of reform-minded families began to experiment with new forms of education for their daughters. A girl, who might once have been married off at 14, was now sent to a girls' school. She learned to read, she memorized poems, she studied history. In rare cases, she even studied mathematics or foreign languages. For the most part, this education was still geared toward making her a better wife and mother, but it planted seeds. The daughters of these families began to ask questions their mothers had not dared to ask. Marriage reform became a subject of intense debate among scholars, politicians, and writers. Should women be allowed to choose their own husbands? Should foot binding be abolished? Should dowries be made optional? Should girls have the right to refuse a marriage arranged in childhood? These questions were discussed in newspapers, debated in salons, and whispered about in private homes. Reformers argued that the strength of the nation depended on strong families, and strong families required mutual respect between husband and wife. Conservatives responded that order, harmony, and tradition were already perfect, and that to question them was to invite chaos. For brides in transitional households, families caught between generations. The tension was acute. stories changed the imagination. For the first time, a bride could picture another life. In literature, especially the new vernacular fiction of the late Qing, heroines appeared who rejected their fates, who fled wedding processions, or who fell in love outside of arranged bonds. These tales were not always happy, but they were new, and they reached a growing audience. Still, most weddings in the countryside remained unchanged. A bride in a rural province in 1880 or 1890 still left her family home in a red veil. She still wept quietly with her mother before stepping into the sedan chair. She still bowed before unfamiliar ancestors and entered a household where her position was uncertain. But the wind had shifted. Perhaps she had heard rumours of the Empress Dowager's decline. Perhaps she had seen posters denouncing foot binding, or caught a glimpse of a woman in foreign dress walking with her head held high. Change, once distant, now moved faintly at the edges of her vision. In this climate, foot binding became one of the first visible battlegrounds in the redefinition of marriage and womanhood. For centuries, bound feet had been seen as a marker of beauty, refinement, and status. Girls underwent the painful process as early as 5 years old, their feet broken and reshaped to fit a small, curved ideal. It was a practice tied directly to marriageability. Mothers bound their daughters' feet to ensure good matches. A bride with unbound feet was often seen as unrefined, unmarriageable. But in the 1890s and early 1900s, reformers began a campaign to end the practice. Educated women wrote essays against it. Schools refused to admit girls with bound feet. New women's associations declared the practice barbaric and incompatible with progress. At the same time, conservative elders defended it as a necessary tradition, arguing that a woman without bound feet would be seen as wild or undesirable. In some households, this created conflict. Mothers who insisted on binding, daughters who resisted, fathers caught in the middle. And for the brides themselves, it created a strange duality. In one part of the country, a girl might be praised for her natural feet. In another, she might be mocked. Marriage was no longer just about ritual, it had become a public symbol of which side of history a family stood on. Meanwhile, the legal framework of marriage began to shift. Qing law, based on centuries-old Confucian codes, gave the husband absolute authority within the household. A wife could not initiate divorce. She could be dismissed for failing to bear children, for speaking back, or for violating family rules. But new voices began to demand reform. Intellectuals like Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao criticized the old marriage system and called for equality, education, and voluntary unions. Though their influence was limited to elite circles, the conversation was happening. At the same time, Christian missionaries promoted a different model of marriage, one based on monogamy, personal choice, and shared responsibility. Their schools for girls offered literacy, basic medical training, and instruction in Christian domestic ideals. In some cases, these schools became shelters for girls fleeing arranged marriages. A girl who escaped her wedding procession might be taken in, educated, and eventually married to someone of her choosing. These stories were rare, but they became symbolic. By the early 20th century, some families in reform-minded regions began to abandon formal betrothal rituals. A few allowed daughters to meet potential suitors. Some began to eliminate the bride price or reduce the scale of the dowry. In others, couples staged mock-arranged marriages to appease the older generation while privately choosing each other beforehand. The visual elements of marriage remained: red dresses, banquets, bowing rituals, but the substance had begun to shift. Still, for the average bride in the last years of the Qing, her day remained deeply traditional. She dressed in red. She wept as she left home. She entered the new household with fear and formality. She served tea, bore children, and managed the household. But her children would grow up in a different world. They would see revolutions. They would read newspapers. They would ride trains. They would live through the collapse of the empire. In 1911, the Qing dynasty fell. The Republic of China was declared. Imperial rule was over. And with it, the legal structure that had governed marriage for more than 2,000 years. The emperor was gone. The Confucian Code, though still influential, was no longer the law of the land. And with that collapse came the possibility of redefining what marriage could be. But tradition does not vanish overnight. For the next generation of brides, the weight of the past would still hang in the air, woven into silk veils, embroidered into dowry chests, folded into family expectations. Yet the world was changing, and the red wedding procession now walked not only through the lanes of ancient cities, but into the uncertain road of modern China. With the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, China entered a new chapter. The imperial system collapsed. The Republic of China was established. And though the landscape remained fractured, marked by warlords, regional divisions, and political instability, there was a collective sense that the country could be remade. For women, and especially for brides, this promise came with both hope and conflict. The ideals of choice, freedom, and individuality entered public debate, but the traditions of the past still lingered in homes, in customs, in expectations whispered from mother to daughter. Marriage, once the most rigidly codified institution in Chinese life, began to bend. In cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin, the old forms of matchmaking started to weaken. While arranged marriages still dominated, they were increasingly accompanied by new forms of courtship. Supervised visits between families, letter writing, chaperoned walks in public gardens. The traditional 6 rites, once essential to a proper wedding, were sometimes reduced or reshaped entirely. A wedding could now include a Western-style ceremony with music and seating arrangements, followed by a traditional Chinese banquet. Some couples posed for photographs in Western suits and white dresses, while still performing ritual bows to their elders. These combinations were not contradictions. They reflected a culture in transition, where the past was not yet gone and the future had not yet arrived. The idea that a bride could consent to, or even choose her marriage partner, began to appear in law and in literature. In 1914, the Republic passed a civil code that preserved many Confucian family principles, but offered limited legal recognition of women's rights. It was now possible, in theory, for a woman to reject an unwanted match or file for divorce under certain circumstances. In practice, however, these rights were unevenly applied and rarely exercised, especially in rural areas. Social stigma remained powerful. Families feared disgrace. A bride who refused her betrothal risked not only her own reputation, but the standing of her parents and siblings. Despite this, reformers pushed forward. One of the most visible movements of the early 20th century was the campaign against arranged marriage and for so-called free marriage, where couples would choose each other based on affection or shared values. These ideas were championed in newspapers, university journals, and by young writers. The famous May 4th movement of 1919, a student-led protest against traditional authority and foreign influence, also brought women's rights to the forefront. Leading intellectuals argued that the strength of the nation depended on educated, autonomous women, free to marry and free to divorce. Female students were among the first to adopt these new values. In the cities, Girls who once would have been married off at 14 were now staying in school. They wore short jackets, bobbed their hair, and read novels about women choosing their husbands, building careers, or even living alone. Some declared openly that they would never marry. Others formed relationships in secret, away from parental control. These acts were small revolutions, deeply risky, but deeply meaningful. And yet, these freedoms were mostly confined to a narrow urban elite. In the countryside, where most of China's population still lived, traditional marriage customs continued. Brides were still selected through family negotiations. Betrothal gifts were exchanged. Wedding days still began with tears and ended with ritual. A rural bride in 1920 might wear the same red silk robe her mother had worn, ride the same decorated sedan chair, and enter her new family with the same bowed head and silent demeanour. But she might also have heard rumours. Stories of women attending university. Stories of girls who sent back their betrothal gifts. Stories of teachers, nurses, or factory workers who never married at all. In urban centres, the image of the bride was evolving. The white wedding dress, introduced by Western missionaries and adopted in cosmopolitan circles, became a new symbol, no longer of obedience, but of personal choice. Newspapers featured wedding photos of celebrity couples smiling at each other, sometimes even holding hands. The red veil was replaced by a gauzy white one. The groom wore a tailored suit, the vows were spoken aloud. Guests gave speeches. The old symbols, firecrackers, dowries, bowing rituals, were still present, but they were rearranged to fit the new script. Marriage was still a performance, but now the bride had lines to speak. This changing image was not without resistance. Many elders viewed these modern weddings as improper. They lamented the loss of virtue, the fading of modesty. They warned of rebellious daughters and broken households. But even within conservative families, compromises were made. A daughter might choose her own match, but still undergo the tea ceremony. A couple might forego the traditional vows, but still wear red to the banquet. The institution adapted, stretched, reshaped. Labour also changed the experience of being a bride. As more women entered factories, offices, and schools, their economic role in the household shifted. A bride who brought not only a dowry but a salary had a different kind of value. In some cases, she helped support her husband's family. In others, she gained small freedoms, control over her purchases, a say in family finances, a private savings account. These were not universal shifts, but they hinted at the changing balance of power within marriage. The bride of the Republican period could still be silent and veiled, but she might also be photographed at her wedding with a book in her hand. She might write essays about her expectations of marriage. She might send letters to a friend about her fears, her boredom, or her hopes. Her life was still circumscribed, but she now knew that other lives were possible. Literature played a significant role in shaping this awareness. Novels by writers like Lu Xun and Ding Ling explored the inner lives of women, wives trapped in loveless marriages, young women resisting betrothal, widows remarrying despite social scorn. These stories offered not just critique, but imagination. They gave readers, especially women, a new vocabulary to describe their own feelings. The role of the bride was no longer merely functional. It had become psychological, political, and deeply personal. Yet the pressure to conform remained intense. Many women experienced a dual reality, public compliance and private dissatisfaction. They smiled for the family photograph, bowed at the proper moments, served tea with both hands. But in their minds, questions persisted. Was this truly their choice? Could they have lived another way? Would their daughters live differently? In the Republican period, divorce became slightly more accessible. Legal reforms allowed both men and women to petition for divorce on grounds such as cruelty, abandonment, or incompatibility. But social attitudes were slow to change. A divorced woman still faced stigma, reduced marriage prospects, and often economic hardship. Families discouraged separation at all costs. Brides were still advised, above all, to endure. Yet some did leave. A few returned to their natal homes, bringing their children with them. Others joined women's associations, became teachers, or took jobs that allowed them to live independently. These were still exceptions, not norms, but their existence mattered. They proved that the mold could be broken. For many brides of the 1920s and 1930s, marriage was still a negotiation between generations. Between a grandmother who remembered foot binding and a granddaughter who read translated novels from Japan or France. Between a mother who had never seen her husband before the wedding night and a daughter who chose her groom from a university classroom. This negotiation was delicate, uneven, and often painful, but it reshaped the very foundation of marriage in China. As the country moved closer to war, occupation, and eventual revolution, the image of the bride continued to evolve. The quiet housewife, the veiled maiden, the reluctant daughter, all remained present. But now there was also the student bride, the working bride, the bride who wrote essays in magazines, the bride who married for love, the bride who stayed single. The role had multiplied. Still, tradition was not gone. Even the most modern wedding retained traces of the past. The colour red, the presence of elders, the offering of tea. A modern bride might raise her glass to make a toast, but she would also lower her head when entering her new home. She carried both worlds, one in each sleeve. In the next part, we'll follow how war, revolution, and the rise of the People's Republic would reshape marriage once again. This time from the top down. Laws would be rewritten. The role of the bride would be redefined by the state. And the ceremony, once ruled by ancestors and family ties, would come to serve an entirely different master. By 1949, the founding of the People's Republic of China marked a radical break from the past. The Communist Party, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, did not simply intend to govern the country, it intended to transform it. In nearly every sphere of life, tradition was re-examined, restructured, or removed. Marriage, long considered a private matter, governed by family, ritual, and local custom, became a political subject. And the bride, once dressed in red and defined by her obedience, was now cast into a completely new role, a citizen of the socialist state. The transformation began with law. In 1950, just months after the establishment of the new government, the Chinese Communist Party passed the new marriage law, a sweeping, landmark piece of legislation that abolished arranged marriage, outlawed concubinage, granted women the right to divorce, and required mutual consent for marriage. It was, at its core, a declaration that marriage was no longer a family matter. It was now a civil contract between two individuals, governed by the state. For women, especially those living in cities or working in party-affiliated jobs, the change was immediate and profound. Under the old system, a girl might be promised to a man in infancy, bound by betrothal gifts and family honour. Now she could reject a match outright. She could choose her own partner. She could end a marriage without needing her husband's permission. The language of the law was clear. Women and men were equal under marriage, with equal rights to enter and dissolve the union. But the real test came in enforcement. Across the country, cadres were sent to rural villages, urban neighbourhoods, and factory dormitories to educate the public on the new law. Mass meetings were held. Posters were pasted on walls. Radio broadcasts declared that freedom in marriage is a basic right of the people. In some areas, the response was enthusiastic. Young couples filed for registration without consulting their elders. Women who had been trapped in abusive or unwanted marriages applied for divorce. Public ceremonies replaced ancestral rites. In factories and schools, group weddings were organised, sometimes involving dozens of couples lined up before a stage, receiving marriage certificates from local officials. Yet resistance remained strong. In traditional households, especially in the countryside, the old customs did not vanish overnight. Elders objected to the idea that daughters could choose their husbands. Some families refused to recognise marriages made without parental approval. In extreme cases, women who tried to leave their husbands were harassed, beaten, or driven from their communities. Cadres sometimes had to intervene directly, protecting women from violence or helping them escape. For brides during the 1950s, this created a strange contradiction. On paper, they had unprecedented freedom. In practice, they navigated a landscape where old and new coexisted awkwardly. A woman might marry for love, register her marriage with the local party office, and still perform a tea ceremony to appease her parents. She might reject a dowry, but still wear red. She might walk herself to the wedding hall instead of being carried in a sedan chair, but still lower her head out of habit. And the revolution did not end with marriage. In the new socialist society, the bride was no longer just a wife, she was a comrade. She was expected to work, contribute to production, and participate in political life. In cities, women were recruited into factories, textile mills, and public offices. In rural communes, they ploughed fields, joined brigades, and attended political study sessions. Marriage was no longer the beginning of a life of domestic seclusion. It was a public, political milestone. The home was still important, but it was no longer the bride's only domain. The aesthetic of weddings also shifted. Red remained the dominant colour, not for ancestral reasons, but because it symbolised revolution. Brides wore red scarves, red jackets, and sometimes red pins bearing the image of Mao. Banquets were modest, gifts were simple. Couples exchanged vows before portraits of Marx, Lenin, and Mao. The ceremony emphasised equality, not hierarchy. In some cases, speeches replaced rituals. The party secretary might speak about collective values. A factory manager might offer a blessing about labour and progress. The double happiness symbol, once associated with Confucian ideals, was now reframed to represent the harmony of socialist unity. Even the language changed. Wives were no longer referred to in terms of submission or purity. They were comrades. Marriage was discussed as a partnership between equals, both contributing to the building of the new society. In public, the image of the modern bride was practical, strong, and politically engaged. She wore her hair short. She carried a work satchel. She was not to be praised for beauty or modesty, but for diligence, ideological commitment, and productivity. But the transition was not always smooth. While official discourse celebrated equality, many women still bore the double burden of labour and domestic responsibility. After working long shifts in factories or fields, they returned home to cook, clean, and care for children. Divorce, while legal, remained stigmatised. Women who left their husbands were often blamed, ostracised, or denied custody of their children. And though forced marriages were outlawed, informal pressure from families, neighbours, or local officials sometimes replaced it. In minority regions, marriage reform introduced additional complexities. Ethnic groups such as the Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Zhuang had their own matrimonial customs, some involving polygamy, bride prices, or clan arrangements. The Communist Party attempted to reform these practices while preserving ethnic autonomy, leading to a patchwork of local policies. In some areas, traditional rituals were preserved alongside state registration. In others, cultural practices were suppressed or reframed to align with socialist principles. Despite these challenges, the new marriage law marked a turning point in Chinese history. It established the idea that women had legal agency in marriage. It gave them, for the first time in centuries, the right to say no. For the brides of the 1950s and 60s, this meant that a wedding was no longer a submission, but a declaration. It was a civic event, a political act, and sometimes, even quietly, a personal choice. In the 1960s, with the launch of the Cultural Revolution, the personal became even more political. Weddings were discouraged as bourgeois. Romantic love was seen as counter-revolutionary. Traditional symbols, like phoenix crowns, embroidered gowns, or ancestral offerings, were condemned as feudal relics. Some couples skipped ceremonies entirely. Others married in military uniform or simple grey tunics. Photos from this era showed couples standing stiffly, unsmiling, holding their marriage certificates like identity cards. No flowers, no feast, no fanfare. The bride's role had been stripped of ornament. She was now a revolutionary woman, devoted to the collective. During these years, the emotional life of brides was often submerged beneath slogans. Love, grief, frustration, all were subordinated to duty. Yet beneath the surface, women still carried the same hopes, fears, and questions that had shaped generations before. Was her husband kind? Would her children be healthy? Could she find a moment of rest between factory shifts and evening meetings? In dorm rooms and work units, brides formed friendships, whispered secrets, and sometimes found joy. Brief, fragile, but real. It wasn't until the 1980s, after the end of the Cultural Revolution and the beginning of economic reforms, that marriage in China entered its next phase, a phase marked by consumer culture, personal expression, and a return, in some cases, to ceremony. But the legacy of the revolutionary decades remained. The bride had been rewritten. She was no longer the property of her family. She was no longer a gift to be exchanged. She had a name, a job, a registration number. She could choose, leave, return. Still, even in the most modern cities, traces of the old world lingered. A mother reminded her daughter to lower her eyes during the tea ceremony. A grandmother insisted on red paper cuttings above the bed. A father gave his blessing in silence. The past, long buried, still spoke, softly, insistently, in the folds of a red silk dress worn beneath a modern jacket. In the next section, we'll follow this final chapter, the rise of urban weddings, the commercialization of romance, and the way brides in modern China now stand between history and invention, still searching for balance on the threshold of tradition and freedom. In the wake of the Cultural Revolution, China entered a new era. The 1980s brought with it a profound shift, not just in economics, but in values, behavior, and everyday life. As Deng Xiaoping launched sweeping reforms to open China's markets and decentralize control, ordinary people began to imagine new futures. And for brides, this shift offered both relief and challenge. The revolution had granted them rights. The reforms now gave them choices. One of the clearest signs of change was the wedding itself. After decades of austere ceremonies, revolutionary slogans, and registry office marriages performed in grey tunics. Couples in the 1980s began to reclaim the idea of a celebration. The wedding was no longer just a civic act. It became a personal milestone again, a chance to express not only commitment, but taste, status, and emotion. Red returned, but so did white. Veils reappeared, but so did music, flowers and laughter. And brides, once symbols of obedience or political purity, were reimagined as individuals. In the 1980s, the typical urban bride might still live in a danwei, a work unit compound, with her parents. Her marriage was likely approved, or at least acknowledged, by both families. But it was increasingly chosen, not assigned. Courtship before marriage became more common, even expected. Couples met at dances, in libraries, at school, or in the workplace. They wrote love letters. They walked together in parks. Though dating was still somewhat restrained, especially in public, the idea of marrying for love rather than duty had taken hold. At the same time, weddings began to incorporate new elements. Some couples posed for formal studio portraits, dressed in Western-style gowns and tuxedos, framed by artificial flowers and soft lighting. These photos were printed in colour and proudly displayed in homes. Banquets grew larger, sometimes held in hotel restaurants. Guests brought cash gifts in red envelopes, and the couple returned the favour with cigarettes, candy, and small tokens. The double happiness character was still pasted on walls, but it now appeared alongside balloons and banners printed with the couple's names. Despite these changes, many old customs persisted. Tea ceremonies were still held. The bride was still escorted from her parents' home to the groom's. In some cities, the traditional wedding sedan chair was replaced by a borrowed car or a small van, but the symbolism remained. The bride was still leaving one household and entering another. She still knelt to serve tea to her new in-laws. She still heard her mother whisper quiet advice as she stepped out the door. Be patient, be respectful, work hard. In rural areas, these transitions came more slowly. The distance between reform and reality could be measured in kilometres. In some villages, arranged marriages persisted well into the 1990s. A young woman might still be introduced to a man she barely knew, with the match made by elders and agreed upon without her full consent. Though illegal, such arrangements were often seen as practical, even necessary. Social pressure remained strong. A daughter who rejected her match might shame the family. In these communities, the modern bride still resembled her ancestors, veiled, silent, uncertain. And yet even here, the world was changing. Televisions became common. Newspapers reached further. Girls went to middle school, sometimes even university. If a young bride returned to her village, wearing trousers and carrying books, her presence alone challenged the expectations of her neighbours. If she spoke confidently to her husband, or suggested a different way to manage the household, she disrupted 1,000 years of quiet submission. These were not revolutions with flags or slogans. They were small shifts, but they mattered. One major development was the introduction of the one-child policy in 1980. For many brides, this changed the core purpose of their marriage. No longer expected to bear multiple sons, they were now asked to raise a single, well-educated child. The state encouraged late marriage and smaller families. This gave some women more time to finish school, work, or delay motherhood. It also subtly redefined the role of the wife. Her value no longer lay solely in fertility. She was now a caretaker, a teacher, a household manager, and increasingly a wage earner. Economic reforms also brought consumerism. For the first time in decades, weddings became industries. Dress shops opened. Wedding planners emerged. Entire businesses were built around photography, banquet halls, invitation printing, and car rentals. The wedding dress itself transformed. White gowns became popular, not as Western imports, but as fashionable local adaptations. Brides in Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou wore fitted lace, off-the-shoulder bodices, and tulle skirts. These gowns were rented, not owned, but they symbolized status. Red was still used, especially for the tea ceremony or the banquet, but white had arrived, and it stayed. Marriage registration also changed. Couples now went to government offices to obtain a red booklet, the official certificate of marriage. This small, paper-bound document replaced ancestral records, temple seals, and family contracts. Marriage became a state matter, not a clan matter. It could be entered and exited with paperwork, not rituals. Divorce, while still stigmatized, became more accessible. Women who were unhappy in marriage had the legal option to leave, and some did. Brides of the 1990s were different from their mothers. They were more likely to work outside the home, more likely to have some say in their marriage, more likely to manage finances jointly with their husbands. Some kept their maiden names in professional settings. Some postponed childbirth. Some returned to work within weeks after giving birth. These changes were not always dramatic, but they reflected a deeper shift. The idea that a bride could also be a person. Still, the pressures were not gone. A bride was still judged by her in-laws, by her community, by her own family. Was she respectful? Was she feminine enough? Did she dress properly? Did she care too much about her career? Did she speak too loudly at dinner? And new pressures emerged. Was her wedding glamorous? Were the photos stylish? Was the banquet up to standard? The market replaced the ancestors. Appearances became another form of obedience. In literature and film, the bride became a figure of exploration. Directors like Zhang Yimou and writers like Su Tong explored the conflict between old and new. Their stories often featured brides trapped in marriages they did not choose, struggling to assert identity in a world of expectations. These works, though often set in the past, resonated deeply with audiences navigating the present. They reminded viewers that tradition was not a memory, it was a living force. The image of the bride was no longer singular. In the 1980s and 90s, she might be a worker, a teacher, a businesswoman, or a student. She might wear a red chipao or a white gown. She might host a traditional banquet or dance in a rented ballroom. She might bear a child quickly or delay for years. The path was no longer prescribed, but that freedom came with uncertainty. Urbanization accelerated these changes. Millions of rural workers moved to cities, creating new social dynamics. Inter-regional marriages increased. Some couples married across dialects, class lines, and even language barriers. Courtship shifted to include dating agencies, newspaper ads, and, eventually, online forums. The bride was no longer confined to her village or neighbourhood. She could move, choose, and negotiate. But for many, the gap between law and custom, between image and reality, remained wide. A bride might sign her own marriage certificate, but still defer to her husband in public. She might be praised at her workplace, but criticised at home. She might dream of a different life, but feel guilty for wanting it. The freedom to marry did not guarantee happiness within marriage. The freedom to choose did not eliminate the burden to please. By the early 2000s, these contradictions were part of the fabric of modern life. The bride had changed, legally, visually, socially, but she still carried generations of expectation on her shoulders. Her smile in wedding photos was real, but behind it was complexity. Pride, pressure, fear, love. She was not the silent figure of dynastic ritual, nor the revolutionary comrade of Mao's era. She was something in between. She stood at a threshold, wearing heels and holding flowers, wondering what came next. In the next part, we'll explore the new millennium, where the Chinese bride becomes an icon of globalization, consumer power, and identity formation, while still searching for meaning in an age of plenty, performance, and paradox. As China entered the 21st century, the image of the bride evolved once again. This time, not by state decree or revolutionary struggle, but through the quiet power of prosperity, aspiration, and personal branding. For thousands of years, marriage in China had been about family, continuity, and community duty. Now, increasingly, it became about love, self-expression, and lifestyle. This change was driven by the rapid transformation of the country itself. In a matter of decades, China had gone from an agrarian society to an industrial and consumer powerhouse. Cities expanded, wealth accumulated, education levels rose, and with this came a new generation of women, more literate, more mobile, and more exposed to global culture than any before them. These women were still daughters and brides, but they were also professionals, travellers, and entrepreneurs. For many of them, marriage remained important, but how it was approached changed dramatically. The wedding, once a family affair grounded in ritual, became an elaborate performance. Planners were hired, venues were scouted. Photographers travelled to distant provinces, or even abroad, to shoot bridal portraits in forests, beaches, historic towns, or luxury hotels. A wedding might include a traditional ceremony in the morning, a Western-style procession in the afternoon, and a nightclub reception at night. Dresses were custom-tailored, cakes were imported, songs were choreographed. Vows were spoken not before ancestors, but before cameras. The modern Chinese bride often wore multiple dresses over the course of the day. A white gown for the formal ceremony, a red qipao for the tea ritual, a third dress, perhaps gold, silver or champagne, for the banquet. Each change of clothing was symbolic, but also aesthetic, meant to please guests, impress relatives, and document each moment for social media. Beauty, elegance, and poise were no longer private virtues. They were public performances. In urban centres like Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Chengdu, weddings became status symbols. The size of the banquet, the cost of the venue, the name of the planner, all became proxies for family wealth and taste. This added pressure to an already delicate moment. Brides were expected not only to be gracious daughters-in-law and loving wives, but also perfect hosts, fashion icons, and social diplomats. The planning process could take months. The expectations were high. At the same time, matchmaking itself underwent a transformation. While some young people still met through introductions arranged by family or friends, others turned to dating apps, online forums, and professional agencies. Marriage markets popped up in parks, where parents displayed handwritten resumes of their single children, listing height, income, education, and real estate ownership. In these spaces, a bride was no longer a symbol of virtue. She was a candidate, a profile, a line on a spreadsheet. For some women, this was liberating. They could compare, choose, negotiate. They could delay marriage until they found the right partner, or until they achieved personal goals. But for others, the process was demoralizing. The pressure to marry before 30, the questions from relatives at every spring festival, the reminders that a good match was also a race against time. These tensions gave rise to a new term, leftover women, or shengnu. It was used to describe unmarried women in their late 20s or older, often highly educated, professionally successful, and financially independent. The label was not neutral. It carried judgment. It suggested failure. And yet, many of these women rejected the term, choosing instead to redefine what adulthood, marriage, and happiness meant to them. Some chose not to marry at all. Others partnered without formal registration. Still others froze eggs, lived alone, or pursued relationships outside of cultural expectations. In each case, the role of the bride was dissented. She could exist and thrive without the red veil, without the banquet, without the title. And yet for millions of women, becoming a bride remained a cherished dream. Not for the dowry, the duty, or the ritual, but for the celebration, the partnership, the belief in love. The modern Chinese bride often walks down the aisle hand in hand with the man she chose, before guests she invited, in clothes she designed or selected herself. Her parents may still cry. Her grandparents may still urge her to bear sons. But her wedding is her own. Even the rituals have adapted. The tea ceremony is now framed as an expression of gratitude, not submission. Bowing to in-laws is reinterpreted as mutual respect. The giving of red envelopes is both custom and cash, a practical nod to modern life. Firecrackers are often replaced with digital fireworks on LED screens. Photographers pose guests into shapes, fly drones over rooftops, and create short films documenting the day. The wedding album is now a cinematic archive. But despite the glamour and spectacle, the modern bride still walks a narrow ridge between tradition and choice. After the ceremony, she may face new expectations. Should she quit her job to raise a child? Should she move into her in-laws' home? Should she adopt her husband's surname or keep her own? Will she be allowed, by unspoken rule, to make decisions in the household? These questions are rarely answered in the vows, but they unfold in the years after the music stops. And not all weddings are fairy tales. Economic inequality means that not everyone can afford the idealised wedding. Some young women still face family pressure to marry men they barely know. Some rural areas report bride shortages, leading to coercion or trafficking. Some women find themselves in marriages where legal equality exists on paper, but not in practice. Divorce rates have risen. Domestic violence persists. The bride may have changed costumes, but the stage is not always safe. Still, there are new forms of resistance. Some women host solo weddings, dressing in bridal attire to celebrate their independence. Some couples choose not to have children. Others co-parent after divorce. The state, once deeply invested in regulating marriage, has begun to loosen its grip. Restrictions on marriage age have been relaxed. Divorce, though recently subjected to a cooling-off period, is more common. The bride is no longer bound to remain. In Chinese pop culture, the bride appears as an icon in both fantasy and critique. She is the heroine in romantic dramas, the villain in tabloid scandals, the subject of viral wedding videos, the face of cosmetic brands. She is loved, envied, mocked, admired. She sells products. She embodies aspiration. She becomes a meme. And yet behind the screen, she is still real. A woman with hopes, anxieties, and her own story. Across China today, weddings happen every hour. Some are lavish, others simple. Some follow centuries-old customs. Others invent new ones. Some begin with love, some with compromise, some with a quiet shrug. But each one carries the trace of every bride who came before. The Zhou girl in red silk, the Tang bride with her phoenix crown, the Ming daughter kneeling before her in-laws, the Republican woman in a white dress, the comrade bride of the 1960s, the office worker bride of the 1990s. Each one in her own way stepped into a new role. Each one crossed a threshold. And so, in the stillness of a modern bridal suite, in the quiet before the guests arrive, before the vows are read, before the doors open and the bride walks in, there is always a pause, a breath, a memory of everything this moment has ever meant. And then she stands, and then she walks, across the mountains, deserts and grasslands of China, far from the palaces and cities that shaped Han marriage traditions. There have always been other weddings. Brides dress not in red silk, but in wool, silver, fur, or dyed cotton. Songs that were not sung in Mandarin, but in Tibetan, Uyghur, Yi, Bai, Kazakh, Hani, Miao, and dozens more. Each ethnic group carried its own customs, rhythms and rules, shaped by climate, belief, migration, and the particular weave of memory that defined its people. For many of these communities, marriage was not simply a contract or ceremony. It was the heart of cultural continuity, a way to bind generations, transmit identity, and inscribe shared belonging onto the land. The bride in these traditions did not step into a husband's lineage in the same way Han brides did. In some cases, she remained connected to her natal family. In others, she held land or livestock in her own name. Her role was defined not by Confucian texts, but by local practice, oral, flexible, sometimes spiritual. Among the Tibetan people, for example, marriage customs varied by region and class. In pastoral communities, polyandry was practiced, one woman married to multiple brothers, to preserve family land and ensure survival in a harsh, high-altitude environment. The arrangement was not seen as scandalous, but as practical. The bride managed the household, coordinated resources, and ensured the children were raised with shared responsibility. While this practice has declined in modern decades, its existence illustrates how marriage could be shaped entirely by geography and need. Tibetan brides also participated in rich symbolic rituals. On the day of the wedding, she might wear a heavy brocade robe adorned with turquoise and coral, her hair braided with red yarn, her ears and neck weighted with ancestral ornaments. Guests danced in circles around her. Butter lamps were lit. Lamas offered blessings. And when she entered the home of her husband, or husbands, she did so with full recognition of her spiritual and domestic importance. In contrast, among the Miao people of southern China, wedding attire took centre stage. Miao brides often wore elaborate silver headdresses, some towering over a foot high, decorated with dragons, phoenixes, and intricate latticework. Their clothes were embroidered by hand, motifs of birds, butterflies, rivers, and ancestors stitched in layers of meaning. The wedding procession was both a fashion display and a storybook. Each item of clothing told a tale. Each piece of jewellery had been passed down, polished, and worn by women who remembered. The wedding itself included music played on Lusheng pipes, food offered in rounds, and often a mock bride-stealing ritual, where the groom's family would symbolically carry off the bride after a staged negotiation. These performances were playful, but also embedded with communal memory. They recalled times when inter-village conflict, feuds, and social alliances were managed through such arrangements. They preserved the idea that marriage was never just personal. It was social, economic, political. In the grasslands of the north and west, Kazakh and Mongolian weddings emphasized mobility and hospitality. Brides rode on horseback, escorted by singing relatives, toward yurts filled with dried meats, kumis, and festively painted rugs. Ceremonies often took place outdoors, under open sky, with toasts made in bowls of fermented mare's milk. The bride, dressed in fur-lined robes and tall feathered hats, might be greeted with verses of praise, or songs invoking clan history. These weddings were communal events, drawing hundreds of guests, sometimes lasting for days. Among Hui Muslim communities, marriage carried additional religious dimensions. The ceremony included Islamic prayers, readings from the Quran, and the signing of a nikah, a marriage contract specifying the dowry, obligations, and mutual consent of the couple. The bride wore modest clothing, sometimes a white headscarf or veil. No alcohol was served. The event was marked by both celebration and piety. Hui brides were often active participants in community education and religious life, and the wedding was framed as both a personal commitment and a sacred duty. Other ethnic groups practiced matrilineal traditions where descent was traced through the mother's line. Among the Mosuo people near Lugu Lake, a unique system known as the walking marriage existed. In this tradition, women did not formally marry or move into a husband's household. Instead, they maintained lifelong ties to their maternal families, and men visited their partners by night, returning each morning to their own homes. Children were raised by the mother's extended family, and women managed property, inheritance, and household leadership. Mosuo bride was never given away. She stayed, and her strength was not transferred, but multiplied. Though the Chinese state often viewed such practices as backward or unorthodox during the 20th century, many have survived through quiet persistence. Some have adapted to new legal frameworks. Others have blended tradition with modern elements, holding official registry ceremonies alongside ancestral rites. And some have faded, remembered only in festivals, in stories, or in photographs hanging on old walls. The experience of being a bride in these communities was shaped by more than ethnicity. Terrain mattered. So did religion, climate, and contact with the Han majority. In some regions, girls went to school alongside their future husbands. In others, they met only on the day of the wedding. In some households, brides had decision-making power. In others, they laboured in silence. No single pattern existed. What united them was continuity, the sense that a wedding was not just the joining of two people, but the confirmation of a people's way of life. Modernity has touched every one of these communities. Highways now cut through mountains. Smartphones buzz with wedding playlists. Government subsidies influence the timing and shape of marriage. Yet brides still dance in handmade skirts, still carry silver combs passed down from their grandmothers. They pose for pictures on plastic chairs under neon signs, wearing clothes their ancestors would recognise. The tea may be sweetened now. The shoes may come from factories instead of looms. But the steps are familiar. There are still mothers who whisper songs while braiding their daughters' hair. There are still fathers who offer a final blessing at the gate. There are still hills echoing with music after the sun has set. And in those moments, the bride is not only herself, she is every woman who has walked the path before her, and every woman who will follow. Even as China's major cities turned toward glass and neon, and rural roads gave way to asphalt and cellular towers, the quiet ceremony of marriage in ethnic minority regions has endured. In Yunnan, Guizhou, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and far beyond, brides continue to thread themselves into customs that have outlived dynasties, revolutions, and economic reinventions. Among the Bai people near Dali, a bride's wedding attire still includes a white wool coat embroidered with alpine flowers, a wide belt symbolising the Milky Way, and headwear designed to resemble snowy mountain peaks. These clothes are not just decorative, they are geographical. They locate the bride within the terrain her people have occupied for generations. The wedding songs, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, are layered with coded wisdom about many of these communities, the bride is not simply sent away. Her departure is accompanied by poems, laments, and chants that mark the moment as both an ending and a blessing. A Miao bride may be led out of her family home in silence, while women behind her sing songs that capture the weight of leaving. Words about rivers, distance, and patience. In Zhuang villages, the bride's family might offer her a red umbrella to shield her on her way, not only from weather, but from misfortune. And yet, adaptation persists. Some brides now use their smartphones to live stream the ceremony to cousins in cities. Some read marriage vows printed on government-issued pamphlets while standing next to elders wearing robes dyed with indigo and bark. Some serve tea and sign legal papers in the same hour. In many places, the practice of bride price still exists, but its meaning is debated. Some see it as tradition, others as transactional. The form remains, the interpretation shifts. In these diverse weddings, the symbols differ, but the stakes feel familiar. A mother standing in a courtyard, handing her daughter a necklace. A grandmother tightening a belt around her granddaughter's waist. A father holding back tears as he adjusts the collar of his daughter's coat. These moments repeat. Whether the bride is entering a Han household in the city or a Kazakh yurt in the grasslands, whether she is signing documents at a registry or riding a horse to her new home, she steps across the same threshold between what was hers and what is now expected of her. The bride in every part of China has never been only one thing. She has been a girl told not to speak, and a woman handed a microphone. She has been silent under a red veil, and she has danced alone beneath LED screens. She has been the reason 2 villages made peace. She has been the prize of a political alliance. She has been the subject of poems and the author of her own. For thousands of years, marriage has been one of the most durable institutions in Chinese life, not because it remained unchanged, but because it has always absorbed the pressure of change. The bride's role within that institution has likewise never been fixed. Her steps have carried the weight of ancestry, family, policy, labour, fashion, and sometimes, quietly, her own wish. She was once bound by duty to strangers selected by a matchmaker. She was once praised for never speaking above a whisper. She was once hidden behind veils not of her choosing. Later, she marched in uniform and was praised for lifting grain sacks and speaking slogans. Later still, she wore white satin and pearls and stood before hundreds to declare, "I do." But across each transformation, dynastic, revolutionary, market-driven, she has remained the central figure in a ritual designed to reorder the world around her. The ceremony is always, in some way, a form of storytelling. The wedding tells a story of who we are, what we value, and what we fear. And every time a bride has stepped into that story, she has carried not only the expectations of others, but her own interpretation of what it means to belong, to serve, to begin again. There are still households where a girl learns to make her wedding dress from her grandmother. There are still girls told to wait for the match to come. There are still mothers who braid their daughters' hair with warnings and encouragements. There are still photographers kneeling to capture just the right tilt of the veil. There are still neighbours who whisper behind their hands if a bride is too bold, too old, too independent. There are still government posters urging women to marry young. There are still women who choose not to marry at all. In this era of unprecedented choice and contradiction, a bride might be expected to be both traditional and modern, humble and assertive, gentle and ambitious. She might be praised for her wedding photos and questioned for her decisions. She might be told that everything is her choice, and then punished for making it. And yet the fact remains, she walks forward, through wedding halls and village lanes. through courthouse corridors and mountain paths, through beauty salons and ancestral altars. Whether holding a bouquet, a passport, a contract, or the hand of a child, she walks. Some walk in joy, some in fear, some in deep uncertainty, some in quiet triumph. What began as a transaction between clans became a pageant of virtue, then a contract of legality, then a celebration of romance, and finally a collage of all these things, folded together, never quite matching, never quite still. The red veil may be lifted, but something older remains behind it. In every step a bride takes, something ancient echoes, and something new begins. The courtyard may be paved now. The sedan chair may be a ride-share car. The wedding guests may be streaming the event from their phones. The meal may be catered. The tea served in porcelain printed with factory logos. But the breath before she enters, the hush before she appears, the shared gaze when she walks in, that moment is eternal. It happened when there were drums and silk. It happened when there were flags and uniforms. It happens now, under chandeliers and neon. A single step, and everything changes. Because the bride is not only beginning a marriage, she is crossing into the oldest story that still lives. Not because it is unchanging, but because she keeps walking into it again and again and writing it new. And in that moment, regardless of where she is, what she wears, or who is watching, she is not only becoming a wife, she is becoming history, quietly, completely.